Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my personal podcast tour of the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe. Straw Dogs, 1971. Sam Peckinpah emerged from the world of TV Western series directing to carve a career that made him a controversial but unique talent in film. He would become an identifiable brand in much the same way as Hitchcock, as famous as his actors for his particular style. His films often examined the same themes repeatedly, an unashamedly masculine world of bonding, and a code of honor often defined by violence that is not only a solution but the true essence of a man's fulfillment. There was a lot more depth and humanity to his work, though, than that narrow reading permits. Peckinpah would sadly find that later on, his recognizable style would be as much a limitation as a blessing in his career, and this would take a disastrous toll on his behavior and professionalism in his decline. His movie directing career almost ended before it had properly begun. He made his feature film debut in 1961 with The Deadly Companions, and then the highly regarded Ride the High Country. But the Charlton Heston Richard Harris historical epic Major Dundee in 1965 was beyond him in its grandiose Hollywood scale. It almost scuppered his career. His drinking and erratic behavior, which hinted at the storm to come, concerned Columbia heads so much that they cut short the filming schedule. Heston, who initially had a very fractious relationship with Peckinpah, soon took to defending him and gave up his salary to enable the beleaguered young director to finish. The final film was a disaster and has since appeared in multiple versions. Peckinpah went from this to being fired shortly after starting work on The Cincinnati Kid. Producer Martin Ransohoff thought he was vulgarizing the picture, with such creative choices as shooting it in black and white. It took 3 years before another studio would give him a chance, and this came with The Wild Bunch through Warner Brothers in 1968. It concerns a group of hard-drinking, whoring outlaws hitting their retirement and still pulling their final scores. Peckinpah invested wholeheartedly in it. He related to the outlaw gang, feeling a great kinship with them. The recurring theme of the man out of time who is hard-living and has a strong moral code of loyalty was one that chimed with him and would echo in his later films, such as, very notably, Straw Dogs. In Peckinpah's world, a man must live a life that fully represents the best of his nature. Critics condemned his films for portraying bloodshed irresponsibly, as suggesting it's the only way a man should solve his conflicts, and for him to truly reflect his masculinity. But, firstly, as writer-director, he never sought to dehumanize his characters into being blood-lustful, kill-crazy monsters. He was careful to build causes and a moral code behind these awful actions, as well as repercussions for growth afterwards. As for the frequent accusations of going too far in on-screen carnage, is it not more irresponsible to sanitize violent actions, to pull the punch, to hide the result of a blood hit? Much as we detest violent resolutions to problems, since it does go on, by hiding the consequences we lie to ourselves, and those old enough to be allowed to see them. That is the real crime. The Wild Bunch doesn't finish with the battlefield deaths as though it's a rousing, air-punching high point to be savored. In the pacing and tone of the closing scene that follows, Robert Ryan is shown in lengthy, quiet close-ups, allowing the audience time to decompress from the intense brutality of what's just happened. We may read regret or resignation into his wonderfully characterful, lined roadmap of a face. A further defense of the violence that shows how out of touch its critics were is the sad reflection of what happened when Peckinpah left such controversial material out of his films, such as the film that came before Straw Dogs, The Ballad of Cable Hogue. He complained, "I am always criticized for putting violence in my films, but when I leave it out, nobody bothers to see them." Peckinpah had switched gears and proved that he could handle other tempos and tones with a surprisingly heartwarming comedy in Cable Hogue. But following the disappointingly lukewarm reception accorded its gentility and freedom from violence, as well as it going drastically over budget, Peckinpah elected to return to the arena of violence that had first established his reputation, and came to England to shoot Straw Dogs. It was based on the novel The Siege of Trencher's Farm by Gordon Williams, who dismissed the screen adaptation by Peckinpah and David Zella Goodman as unfaithful to his work. Peckinpah was unfazed by this, yet it was to be only the mildest of the controversy the film would bring upon him. Much as I've grown to admire the director's work, there are aspects here within the brilliance of this film with which I take strong issue. Straw Dogs is the story of a meek young American maths professor, David Sumner, Dustin Hoffman, who comes to Cornwall with his beautiful young wife Amy, Susan George, to work on a grant-funded research paper. She is restless and soon reignites the interest of her ex-boyfriend Charlie, Del Henney, and the other young male villagers. Gradually, the young couple is ensnared in the slow-burning lust and resentment directed by the townsfolk toward her and he, until she is raped by Charlie and a friend of his. The physical violence is further compounded when David and his wife protect Henry Niles, the simple-minded, troubled villager with past sex offenses whom they hit with their car. They don't know that the confused Niles has accidentally just killed a local teenage girl. When the drink-fueled, resentful vigilantes come to take Niles by force, a siege of the couple's home begins, and David is forced to become resourceful and violent to protect his home, the young man, and his wife, resulting in all the assailants being killed. In the end, shattered but somehow at peace, David leaves to drive Henry home, unsure of his future. The filming of Straw Dogs seemed to go smoothly in the real environs of Cornwall, albeit with the typically cold British weather, although Dustin Hoffman pointed out in a location interview that it would have been much worse back home for him in New York. Peckinpah said in the same program that he'd like to have made a second home in Cornwall, which never ultimately happened but was a nice PR gesture. Peckinpah had a penchant for throwing knives at doors on the set as a way of relaxing. His prop master found some old doors they could put out to save him from damaging ones needed for the set. This eccentric habit became so well known that for his birthday, Keith Moon, Ringo Starr, and Bob Dylan bought him a door as a present. One worrying story was that over the course of shooting, relations between Hoffman and Peckinpah towards Susan George all too closely mirrored the film's distancing between the couple. At first, both men were playful and close in their relationship with her. But as the on-screen plot produces strain between David and Amy, so Hoffman and Peckinpah gradually became similarly isolated and colder toward her. Now, while this could to some extent be mitigated in Dustin's case, due to being caught up in the subjective throes of method preparation, it is much less excusable of Peckinpah. He should have had the benefit of greater overall objectivity, but was intentionally freezing her out. This is backed up by producer Dan Melnick, interviewed in the German documentary I saw, Passion and Poetry, Sam Peckinpah's Straw Dogs. Melnick had urged the director to be gentler with her, but Peckinpah refused. "I'm getting the performance," he said unapologetically. It's hard to forgive this treatment of an actress, particularly a very young, vulnerable one who was required to undergo extremely traumatic rape enactments. That is precisely the time for greater compassion and sensitivity, perhaps even on-set counseling. No film's veracity excuses that behavior, and these days such behavior would never be allowed, as films employ intimacy coordinators to handle the approach and performance of such scenes. This leads us to by far the most troubling element of Straw Dogs, which I'll deal with here in greater detail. The rape scene overshadows everything else in the film, and I feel must be addressed before praising other aspects out of responsibility. Personally, I find these kinds of scenes extremely hard to take, and it's sometimes only under a sense of completion that I watch exploitative films such as I Spit on Your Grave. Specifically, violation of Amy is done twice in the same scene, and whilst the second rape is clearly against her will, I can't accept Peckinpah's defense that she is not consenting as the first goes on. She definitely struggles to begin with, but as Charlie overpowers her and has his way, she changes into urging him to be gentler, caressing and placating him. That can't be interpreted any other way than a move into consent. Even though the two have a past history, it's no defense for forced rape, and ignoring the obvious here does Peckinpah no credit. Another aspect of discontent was the replacement of Norman Savage as editor, as he was secretly feeding back to the studio that Peckinpah didn't know what he was doing with the shooting, and that he couldn't cut the footage together. Roger Spottiswoode took over. Having addressed the most damning part of the film before the ensuing release controversy, let me move on to the areas of Straw Dogs that I feel are hugely praiseworthy. The casting, for example, is tremendous. The villagers, led by the intimidating Peter Vaughan, are impeccable in their simmering resentment and contrasting geniality. David Warner is a shrewdly sympathetic choice for Niles, making great use of his natural vulnerability and inner complexity. Susan George is marvelous as Amy, alternating between sexy and childishly provocative and a heartfelt tortured anguish toward the climactic battle. The absolute standout performance, though, is given by Dustin Hoffman. It would have been a tragedy if Straw Dogs' irresponsible handling of rape had buried this film, as his work is a magnificently nuanced and heartfelt model for complex truth on screen. He is perfectly cast as the mild-mannered, non-confrontational, nebbish David, who gradually is driven to become engaged and let out his capacity for primitive violence in defense of the sanctity of his home and wife. The famous critic Pauline Kael condemned the film for a perceived pleasure taken by David in channeling his primal side into that of a man of violence. I disagree about this being overt, partly because director and actor are careful to never show Hoffman being heroic. His dispatching of the intruders via barbed wire, hot alcohol, and man-trap are always shown as reactive and are driven by fear more than some desire to display impressive kick-ass skills. This is not a Jason Statham or Steven Seagal vehicle where such a character suddenly displays superhuman invulnerability and a badass propensity for macho impressiveness. If that had happened, we would lose any human identification that drives the compelling action so thrillingly. There is risk and vulnerability here constantly during the invasion. We never forget David is having to be resourceful to overcome this awful violation, and much of this is due to Dustin's restraint in committing to the role's integrity. His little smile as he surveys the carnage, murmuring, "Jesus, I got them all," can be read as the wonderment of the little guy who only now realizes he has triumphed over the bullies, not simply as enjoyment of being a successful murderer. Post-traumatic relief is also not the same as sustained pleasure, nor does the film imply that he's now permanently released an uncaged beast of aggression. As he drives Niles away, the second smile that acknowledges an unexpected future is allowable, even though there is a possibly distasteful subtext that it will be without his wife. Norman Savage's criticism of the shot footage in the climax is ironic, as the final 20-minute siege is brilliantly edited, in razor-sharp quick cuts for pace and breathless intensity. The harsh blaring of the bagpipe record is a bizarrely terrific sonic layer adding to the disorientation. Upon release in December 1971, Straw Dogs was heavily condemned for the 2 consecutive rapes and the aforementioned perception that it condoned violent solutions to problems. The timing of the film was unfortunate. The month afterwards, a climate of censorious fervor was whipped up by A Clockwork Orange. Unlike Kubrick's film, though, there were no reported instances of copycat acts of brutality in the aftermath of Straw Dogs, but it still drew unwelcome hostility that detracted from its complex and valid themes. The film struggled with classification, being banned in the UK under the Video Recordings Act on videotape for home audiences, despite being passed uncut originally for the cinema. Over the years, it was belatedly re-released intact, enabling fully informed appraisal, since a former cut version truncated the rape scenes into one and distorted the scene from being fairly judged. David Warner was amused by the pretensions of scholarly critics who believed that his character's lameness and the sling-bound arm of T.P. McKenna in the film were somehow part of a subtextual connection to David's impotence with his wife. In the documentary, he sets the record straight that his injury was a pre-shooting accident that made him skeptical about being fit to do the film, and McKenna's arm damage was caused by someone falling on him during one of the crew parties. Check out the striking posters as well that superbly reflected the turbulent themes of the film. Straw Dogs is ultimately a powerful and complicated film with much to offer, as well as being justifiably controversial. One always has to be mindful that in praising its strong virtues, this in no way discounts its mishandling of a societal taboo as well. Judge for yourself. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe.